So we've got Ransom on this side, who knows if they're gonna get loud.
Yeah.
Right. Let's be honest.
Alright, both of you guys? Yeah. I don't feel my
Grant and I affirm, observation 1, all lives are evaluated equally since any distinguishment of one life from another would be completely arbitrary. Observation 2, the purpose of an action does not affect the moral ramifications of that action. Contention 1, Kingpin strategy proliferates problems. The country's new Attorney General, Jesus Maria Karam, said the Kingpin strategy spawned 60 to 80 small and medium-sized factions that are now fighting amongst themselves for control of lucrative drug plazas and engaging in other criminal enterprises such as kidnapping, extortion, and theft. First, these smaller cartels are more efficient. Colette A. Youngers writes that dismantled cartels are replaced by smaller, leaner operations that are harder to detect and deter. Second, these cartels have spread and increased violence. Rather than stemming the violence, the capture or killing of dozens of major organized crime leaders has made violence more generalized. Their numbers are proliferating from approximately 6 national confederations to 12 today. They've taken on the state and each other in a war of all against all. The removal of cartel leaders has caused the group to fragment, triggering new power struggles that have multiplied the violence. The U.S.-backed Merida initiative will not halt drug trafficking or end organized crime in Mexico or in the region. It will drive criminal networking operations into neighboring countries such as Guatemala, Honduras, and back to Colombia and the Andes. Evidence that drug trafficking operations are moving from Mexico into Central America is already abundant. The Council on Hemispheric Affairs reports that Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala are now among the most violent countries on Earth, with homicide rates of approximately 68, 61, and 46 murders per 100,000 people, respectively. This instability tears at the threads of societies in these nations, which are much smaller and weaker than in Mexico. The growing violence in Central America provides further evidence that U.S. drug policies do absolutely nothing beneficial. The impact on the region can be quantified in a study by Peter Imbush from the University of Wuppertal, who writes that the homicide rate in Latin America has increased by 50%. First, it was the current policy that pushed homicide rates so high initially. Second, the short-term decrease accounts for none of the massive collateral damage. This damage is calculated in the country where we carried out an attempt in long-term policy, namely Colombia, and was empirically shown to be a failure. Contention 2, the guarantee of collateral damage outweighs potential benefits. Subpoint 8, past impacts. Adam Isaacson, Senior Associate for Regional Security Policy at WOLA, writes that first, between 2000 and 2010, over 3 million people were driven from their homes by violence. Second, under pressure to produce high body counts, soldiers allegedly murdered more than 3,000 civilians, the vast majority between 2004 and 2008. Third, of pro-government paramilitary militias massacred, disappeared, displaced, and indiscriminately bombed tens of thousands of Colombian civilians each year. Subpoint B, failure now. Some of the security gains may be transitory. While this guerrilla scope of operations has been reduced, groups' combined strength is still about 10,000 and they carry out attacks on a daily basis. In 2010, guerrilla actions have killed over 450 Colombian military and police personnel, and the same number as in 2002. Thousands of former AUC paramilitaries or new fighters have taken up arms again in a proliferation of new paramilitary groups. There are now 5 or 6 major groupings or new paramilitaries totaling 10,000 members. Their increasing activity underlies a leveling off or reversal in Colombia's drop in violence. Many parts of the country, including major cities like Bogota, Medellin, and Cali, have seen murder rates creeping back up since 2008. Contention 3, fumigation harms. Subpoint A, displacement. Witness for Peace reports the spraying is effective at killing food crops the small-scale farmers and their families rely upon for survival. Fumigations leave poor farmers desperate and without alternatives and fuels internal displacement. Brandy James of Colombia estimates that over 69,000 people have been displaced as a direct result of eradication efforts. Subpoint B, wasteful. First, the hardiness of coca. Witness for Peace writes that one of the greatest ironies of aerial spraying is that coca is one of the crops least susceptible to fumigation. Coca is resilient and can grow back in as little as 1 month. However, fumigation renders the land unusable for 5 to 10 years for most food crops, making the people more dependent on coca. Second is the inelastic demand of coca. A UNDPC describes the balloon effect this way. The successive eradication in one area is temporary as it balloons into other areas. Thank you.
We'll take like questions.
clarification around first off upon observations. First, long-term impacts must be preferred over short-term. Short-term costs are always required for long-term stability, which benefits more generations than short-term costs harm. Second, the resolution asks us to debate the future implications of our current policy today. Thus, any arguments that do not encompass the recent shifts in U.S. policies cannot be weighed. Contention 1, money laundering and terrorism. Hannah Stone from Inside Crime explains that in 2011, the United States faced heavy criticism for failing to crack down on dirty money laundering and drug gangs. Peter Schrader from The Hill continues that beginning in 2012, the U.S. Treasury Department started investigating money laundering operations by Mexican and Colombian cartels, and as Jessica Silver from the New York Times writes, we completely shifted our policy towards aggressively targeting money laundering by the end of 2012. Robert Mazar of Combating Terrorism Center explains that targeting their money supplies is one of the most effective ways to undermine drug cartels and lead to their demise in the long term. In addition, Reuters reports that terrorist organizations, namely Hezbollah, receive substantial funding through drug cartel laundering. The House Committee on Homeland Security finds that the region of Colombia, Paraguay, and Brazil constitutes Hezbollah's most significant source of independent funding, and that cocaine proceeds entering Hezbollah's coffers from Latin America can act as an unlimited source of cheap and easy revenue to carry out potential terrorist attacks. Benjamin Weinthal from the National Interest adds that Hezbollah is currently at the top of U.S. terror threats with more resources than any other terrorist group and 70,000 rockets that they can use to attack Israel and U.S. troops in the Middle East. Contention 2, justice system reform. The Business Insider writes that corruption is rampant in Mexico and is used by cartels to allow them to function normally. Mauser and Francis of Simon Fraser University further that the high level of corruption in the justice system is what led the Mexican government to turn to the military to fight cartels, with the result being a massive increase in violence. The Justice in Mexico Project argues that reforming the justice system is key to solving the region's drug violence problem, as such reforms are empirically successful. Jonathan Rose at University of Miami finds between 2000 and 2008, the U.S. provided $1.3 billion of aid for judicial reform in Colombia, and during that time period, the Heritage Foundation witnessed increases in transparency, speedy trials, and convictions rose from just 3% to 60%. This strengthening of the justice system resulted in a 52% reduction in murder rates in just 6 years in Colombia. In 2010, then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton announced that the U.S. would shift its emphasis away from military assistance and take a similar approach in Mexico. The Wall Street Journal reports that there has been a complete 180-degree shift in U.S. anti-drug assistance to Mexico, with military-based support declining 87% and assistance for judicial reform increasing 92%. The Harvard Institute of Politics writes that this increase in police training is critical to reducing corruption, while adding that in the states where judicial reforms have been implemented, there are now more public defenders, judges are actually present in trials, and conviction rates have doubled. The Council on Foreign Relations points out that violence in the country peaked in 2011, and drug-related homicides have fallen 28%, with the economists arguing that Mexico has finally passed the turning point. The state that has most aggressively implemented such measures is Ciudad Juarez, where as recently as 2008, it was one of the most dangerous places on the planet. In the short time since judicial reform has been instated, according to the University of San Diego, violence in Juarez has plummeted, with murder rates declining 40% in the last year. Newly elected President Enrique Nieto has support to expand similar reforms nationwide, according to the Congressional Research Service, but the International Crisis Group points out that this is a critical window of opportunity to institute lasting reform, and failure at this juncture would only cause violence to increase in the long term. U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry stressed that a continuity in our support for judicial and police reform is fundamental during this presidential transition to ensure any sustained reduction of violence in Mexico in the long term. Unless we ask you to begin.
Is increase in efficiency equal to an increase in the amount of justice? So when you tell, not necessarily, so you tell me there's been an increase in conviction rates from 3% to 60%. How do we, yeah, okay, so how do we know that's like accurate convictions? Why can't judicial, like judges just be bought off to make the wrong decision?
So the important part is that beforehand, in like 80% of cases in Mexico, judges weren't in trouble. Judges would disclose the decision behind doors when they were corrupted by cartels.
But that's what I'm telling you, how do we know corruption still isn't occurring? You just tell me decisions have increased, not that uncorrupt
Because now
decisions.
all the trials in front of the public audience where they have to do like testimony from both sides.
Okay,
And they're
so
held
you're,
publicly
so
accountable.
that's a link that you're making that your evidence does.
I think so.
Okay, you have a question?
Yeah, so your entire first conception and second conception, all these like increasing violence, it's all because of the intention. Like, that's all the, that's the information.
Sure.
Okay,
Militarization
cool.
also.
Alright,
Okay.
so,
Are you gonna argue that militarization has decreased? Okay. At the point where we're doubling the, or, as of 2013, funding for militarization is increasing by 3.5%. Why is that decreasing the amount of funding? Overall in Latin America, the evidence that you're going to read me will be specific to Mexico or Guatemala, I'm guessing, or Colombia.
where are we increasing militarization?
Latin America, overall. 3.5%, I'm not
If
sure.
we're decreasing these countries, where are we increasing?
I mean, in other places, obviously, you're gonna tell me that we're decreasing in Mexico.
Okay, and have we seen violence increase drastically in these countries?
Yes.
But you said it's because of the
Definitely militarization, kingpin, combined.
Yeah, so.
So I have a question for you. Let's talk about like the terminal impact of your risk and mechanism of terrorism. Does the CRS evidence as late of like April of 2013 say there's absolutely no link between terrorist organizations and Mexican drug cartels? The answer is yes. Can you tell me how many people die because of terrorist attacks
Because of terrorist attacks?
globally?
I mean, I
They
guess
have
what, I guess what goes with the Middle East,
How many?
they just go to people in Syria and
How many?
6 people.
And that's because of U.S. drug policy? Okay, so I mean, like, I want how many people would die because of U.S. foreign policy aiding Hezbollah, because one, there is no link, and second, for you to access any effects, you need like.
So what's more important, people are dying or people being displaced?
Well, like, I mean, it's more important that people are dying, but the
Okay,
fact
so
that
that's
people are
like the
being
bigger
displaced.
impact? Like these 69,000 people, if they're still alive, they're just like blockers.
They're not just like, they're living in conditions where they like don't have access to farm for food, they're living in poverty, they're living in like impoverishment.
But like
I
that's
guess.
still good impact.
Like, that's an argument you could make, but
Well,
sure.
you would argue that just like losing money is worse than that.
I mean, like, there's obviously like harms in both, but like, we're not going to argue that lives are the only thing that matter. Lives are probably the most important thing in that round.
So
Okay,
what's-
sure, yeah.
Yeah.
On the first observation, there's going to be a couple of problems. First, if short-term impacts stop long-term impacts from actually materializing in the status quo, you don't see the solvency that they're talking about. And second, they don't tell you why the implication of something in the short term matters more than something in the long term. They can weigh the life. If I lose 5 lives today and 5 lives tomorrow, it doesn't matter that one happened in a day passed. Next, on the next impact, future implications not encompassed by recent policy shifts. They actually have to show you that the policy is shifting, not just the rhetoric that the United States is using. We're going to disprove that later in the case. But let's first go to their first contention about investing, laundering, and cartels completely shifting, and how they're now targeting money laundering. First, they don't tell you how much money we've stopped. Second, they don't tell you how many terrorist attacks this would have stopped if they didn't get this financial aid. Third, they don't tell you that Hezbollah is actually getting the aid from these Mexican drug cartels. They make this link themselves. Look to Mark P. Sullivan, specialist in Latin American affairs, who reported to the United States Department that there was absolutely no link to be found there. Second, you can look to a report on terrorist attacks in the hemisphere, and it found that there's up 40% from 2010 to 2011. So at the point where they're trying to argue that terrorism is decreasing through this method, and we're showing you terrorism is uniquely increasing in the region, they're not going to be getting any impacts off this because clearly money laundering isn't solving. More importantly, they don't actually show you like how much this is stopping terrorism or that terrorism matters. Then you can make a turn because remember, there's been an increase in the amount of cocaine deaths, which is always going to outweigh the deaths that they're giving you from terrorism because terrorism doesn't even kill that many people worldwide, yet alone the link that they're giving you. But you can look to the fact that cocaine deaths in the United States are up 9,000. That's always going to outweigh. Then go to their next contention where they're talking about the justice system in Mexico changing. We have a couple of responses to this, and we're going to make these like topicality arguments. First, they're just empirically wrong. You can look to Newman, who explains that in 2013, the war in Latin America is ballooning at unprecedented rates, and the expensive drug militarization trend is expected to continue exploding. More importantly, just the facts explains that in Central America, we see a 3.5% increase in militarization and police assistance. That's going to be devastating because you're seeing more militarization, not a decrease. Then, they tell you that Nieto is switching policy, but this is empirically disproven, because Nieto is unlikely to jeopardize the generous security assistance provided by the United States, and he's not going to change his policy. This is specifically explained by the fact that Nieto is not offering the details or specifics. In fact, more importantly, experts predict that no change from Calderon's policy. This is going to be important for a couple of reasons. Because none of them are actually saying that he's changing, he's just using verbs to change it. Then, his new plan is to create this new, Marine armory, but the only problem is the people that they're actually getting for this army are coming from the United States. At that, they're coming from the military themselves, so at the point where his plan is to create a 40,000 police force, but he's just taking soldiers from the United States military, they don't tell you why that's uniquely solving. More importantly, they're calling, giving aid to police as a way to solve, but that's not going to work. Then on the judicial system stuff. You're going to turn this for a couple of reasons, because as PBS explains, under intense pressures to solve rising crime, especially by drug gangs, police are sometimes suspected of grabbing and charging the first hapless person they call upon, often a poor person without the resources to generate or actually come up with a defense. And more importantly, the great majority of the accused never see a judge or even an arrest warrant. The conviction rate in Mexico City of those who go to court is an incredible 95%, but 92% of verdicts lack scientific evidence, so you're just falsely prosecuting all these people that they want to tell you that solving. This isn't doing anything in today's round. They're just taking people off the street so they can look like they're impressing the United States and doing such a great job. But this isn't solving back any of the problems. More importantly, when you're putting more people in jail, remember, once you go to jail, you have a horribly ruined reputation. That means when you come out, you're more likely to go back to the drug cartel violences. At that point, A, they're not showing you a topical shift to this policy. Remember, they're still militarizing in the status quo, which means you can make a cross-application of all the impacts we give you out of Calderon's policies. Don't let them tell you there's a 40% decrease in one, region, one municipality. Remember, this is the most important weighing analysis in today's round. At the point, because in the status quo, militarization is occurring, you see a 200% increase in violence. Just because they knocked that down 40% still means it increased in the status quo. That's still going to be a reason to vote for us in today's round. Don't let them stand up here and tell you that marginal decreases are going to outweigh the fact that in the status quo, it pushed it up that high. They can't generate offense off this point. They're not getting the long-term stability because short-term destabilization is never going to allow for it to happen. Thank you.
Okay, if I could see the 3.5 increase in military police assistance and the new men ballooning is expected to be I can write it down. I just have to either way. Oh my, let's stop it flowing. Yeah, I have a flash.
It's on this flash drive.
Cool, perfect. Okay. That's so cute. I didn't think it was
It's not mine. I did this. It's not even.
Yeah, she's got it. Oh, I just took your phone.
all right, technology. Okay. framework in today's round. Remember, they agree in Crossfire that violence is the most important issue in today's round, so you're going to be looking at lives saved through the current U.S. policy. Furthermore, if we're showing you a trend, a shift in U.S. policy, you have to evaluate that. You're evaluating trends. If we're showing you a downward trend, that's what our current policy is. A downward trend in militarization, that's our current policy. So with that, let's look to their first contention, where they talk about how we see all of this kingpin bad stuff. So you can look to the fact that kingpin is actually no longer current policy. You can look to Alejandro Gambo, and he explained Peña Nieto has stated he will not continue the practice of targeting cartel leaders, a change in strategy likely to reduce violence that erupts in response to power vacuums. At the point where they agree in Crossfire that all of these violence impacts off of their first contention come from the kingpin strategy, and that's no longer current policy, they're not getting any of these impacts. But furthermore, remember, we look to the national interest. They explain all the increased cartel activity in Central America is a direct result of military-led offensive against organizations in Mexico during Calderon. So all of this balloon effect that they're talking about is specifically because of militarization under Calderon. Not only are we not doing kingpin anymore, we're not militarizing anymore, and that's the trend that we're looking at right now. So to move, at that point, you're turning these impacts against him because that's really the only link there. Then second of all, you can look to this collateral damage. They tell you how we're first looking to past policy. They don't tell you how past policy compares with current policy. At the point where their own evidence says we're seeing a downward trend in militarization in Central America, you see that we're moving away from this, we're shifting away from this. They talk about how soldiers are murdering people. Remember, we're moving away from giving military aid and towards giving police aid specifically. Remember the Mauser evidence that tells you the military has a different culture than the police. The police is one of law enforcement. They don't tell you how this addresses current policy. If you want to look overall at what's happened in Colombia, where they talk about how we see failure now, the only reason we see increases now in violence in Colombia is because the Colombian government specifically stopped a ceasefire with the FARC. At the point where that has nothing to do with U.S. policy, we actually look at what happened when the U.S. went in because of Plan Colombia. We saw terror go down 84%, murder rates almost halved. And we actually used U.S. policy in Colombia where we rebuilt their judicial system and rebuilt their institutions, which is specifically the example we give you in our case. We saw violence go down. We saw improvement. They then went on to talk about fumigation, and I have a couple of responses to this. So first of all, more people are displaced by drug cartels than are displaced by fumigation. You can look to the Norwegian Refugee Council and Internal Displacement Monitoring Center. When they explain drug cartel displacement is worse than displacement from really anything else, you're seeing hundreds of thousands of people being displaced. So at that point, if we're eliminating cartels and taking out the root of the problem, we're solving that long-term problem. They then go on to talk about how cocoa simply moves. Remember, we saw the total amount of cocaine coming out of South America to the United States go down by 20% from 2012 to 2013. So I don't know where this cocaine is moving to. If it's moving to somewhere else in South America, it sure isn't coming here. So at that point, let's get back to his responses on my case. So it completely ignores the Mazar link in my first contention where we tell you that not only is this essential to terrorists, it's essential to cartels. That we're using money laundering to take out the money going to cartels. At that point, if we're undermining cartels through a method that's not militarization, then ultimately we're seeing decreases in violence overall, and that's always going to be a benefit. He completely ignores that. He goes on to talk about how cocaine deaths have gone up by 9,000 here. You can look specifically to the fact that dealers in the United States, irrelevant of U.S. policy in Latin America, they're actually cutting cocaine with more dangerous substances, and that's why we see cocaine deaths going up here. It has nothing to do with policy in Latin America. We actually see the amount of cocaine coming into the U.S. and cocaine use going down. At that point, you can look to his responses on my second contention. He talks about how ballooning is expected to continue. If you look at the study he reads, it says that military and police aid to the region will fall by 47% due to the budget request from 2009 to 2013, the lowest amount of military and police aid from foreign operations assistance to the region. That's what his own study says. This is a downward trend. That's exactly what I tell you to evaluate. He tells you that the police are charging the first helpless person they see. This sounds really sad, but if you look at what's actually happening, you see violence going down by 47% in one of the most dangerous cities in the world. So clearly, whoever we're charging was pretty violent, because if they're going to jail, we're seeing more and more accountability. We're seeing actually judges showing up. That's what the specific study tells you. We see less and less corruption. We see a better judicial system and a more accurate judicial system. We're solving the problem of violence at its roots, to the point where they agree that's the most important impact in today's round. I strongly urge a calm ballot. Thank you. I just read this sentence. I assume that's what you're going to ask me. There's also this one. Where you're taking breath first. Awesome. Are you guys taking breath?
No, we had 20 seconds.
Sorry.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Ready? 1,
So if I label someone a police officer or a soldier, what's the difference?
Well, a soldier typically, when they're labeled a soldier, means they've gone through military training, which is a culture of violence and collateral damage doesn't matter as long as we get started.
So these new police officers, where are they hiring them from?
They're actually, I'm so happy that you brought that up. If you want to look at this gerrymandery, I don't know how to pronounce it, that called, Yeto's putting in, right? They specifically receive military training but are under civilian control and focus on fighting crimes like robbery and
My
extortion,
evidence says they're still
lessening.
hiring the people you called in your last speech corrupted, violent military members.
But they're under, the difference is they're under civilian control and
That
they're going,
sounds so pretty, but
they're
it doesn't
going-
actually change anything.
I'll finish. They're going through specific training to focus on lessening
They gave
violence.
specific training to the FARC, but they still intentionally
lessening violence?
3,000 false
Wait,
positive
who
killings.
trained the FARC to lessen
No, I'm
violence?
sorry, not FARC. The people who are fighting. So
Okay.
we trained in
So-
Colombia not to go out and do collateral damage, but they were like, "Ooh, we're
Did
under
we?
a lot of pressure."
We told them not to, okay, no, it's not just that, it's about, they're not focusing on taking out the FARC, they're focusing on keeping rule of law. It's not about going in and taking out drug cartels, it's about keeping rule of law.
That's
They're
okay.
a police
Evidence I
force.
read you is very specific in saying Nieto making over-generalized claims is not what's going to happen. I read you military
If the force is
specialists.
successful, the government can lessen its reliance on the military, which has been accused of serious abuses by
That's
human
not going
rights
to
groups.
exist till 2016.
You're the one that brought it up.
And I'm saying the problem is in the status quo, the police force is just hiring soldiers. That's not a change. It is just
Okay,
verbs.
the police
Like,
force
you're
is just hiring soldiers,
We're
so
like mislabeling.
you agree that, but we're training police, right?
They're not doing anything different. Like the terminal impact is the same. It still creates
So-
instability and problems. What
Do
do you
you-
use a police? What are they going to use that 40,000? I don't know
To
how to say
keep
it,
law and
jail-
order, go after
Don't they-
extortion and robbery instead of going after the leaders of drug cartels. That's the
So
exact
when I read
distinction
you
I
the
gave to
evidence
you.
that's very specific and telling you Nieto will still use the kingpin strategy,
Then
how
why?
do you respond? Because he will get financial aid cut off from the United
Why?
States.
But we're demilitarizing. Why would we cut off our aid?
Well, I would argue we're not demilitarizing. You just
If you look at our specific budget numbers, we are.
I would suggest that you're just showing a shift, not
Okay.
an overall change.
So your
in
evidence
the
says we see a downward trend.
in the request, not what was actually passed. Right?
Okay. So what was actually passed? No, what was actually
No,
passed?
it specifically says it looks like a downward trend, but there is a 3.5% increase.
Let's roll that 3.5.
We'll do that later. Okay. Do you have a question for me?
Yeah. So like in Latin America overall, do we see more money given to the armies or less?
Less.
From what time?
If we're, I mean, are
In
you
Latin
looking at Latin
America
America overall? Oh,
overall.
right. So I don't know about Latin America overall, but where are we militarizing? What countries?
I would say Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador.
Do you have evidence specific on that? Because Aishu said she didn't know.
Yes, I think I believe. I'm not
So where have we-
100%
okay,
positive.
sure.
I know that we launch operations in those countries.
Are we
Very
increasing the number of
definitive.
operations that we launch?
Yes. Almost.
I'd like to see that evidence. Have we seen violence go up or down in those
Up.
countries? Oh,
That's
that's
the
cross,
50%
sorry.
number you didn't respond to.
Right.
Are you guys both ready? Great. And all three of you are ready? So I'll start off with two group pictures. First, remember, Grant is very explicit in telling you if the short term creates irreversible instability, long-term impacts become inaccessible. But second, Megan's major response to both our first and second contention is that we're moving away from kingpin strategy and militarization. But remember, the only evidence she provides to support this is Neoto's rhetoric that we may potentially shift in the future away from militarization. But as of now, current policy is militarization, and this is evidence when you see a 3.5% increase in funding. As per her second observation, current policy is kingpinning and militarization. Hold her to that standard. Now, why she's not winning off of her case. First, with respect to terrorism, she never tells you how much we decrease terrorism. Second, it doesn't impact terrorism back to lives, which is the metric she wants to use. Third, we tell you there's no link between drug cartels and terrorism. But lastly, even if you think there's some link there, we've only seen terrorist attacks increase 40% in the Western Hemisphere. This is a clean turn. If you're voting here, vote affirmative. Now let's move on to their second contention, where she tells you that conviction rates have increased. The first question I ask in Crossfire, does that mean that justice has increased? Grant is explicit in telling you 90% of them are false convictions. This only means that corruption is increased because this means that judges are being bought off in favor of the wrong side. But again, another turn you put here is that once they get out of prison, they're more likely to join drug cartels because they have this reputation that can't allow them to get a job anywhere except for drug cartels. Now let's look to violence. Any decrease in violence that she provides you is in certain specific countries or cities. This is why you're going to be referring Grant and I's more holistic analysis we provided in our first contention as the 60 to 80 smaller cartels being actioned into, which increases violence by 50%. The decrease in violence she provides you can be explained by its shifting from those cities that she's analyzing into other cities such as Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. Sorry, those are countries. But still. And those are specifically dangerous because they don't have the infrastructure to handle it. And at the point where our only response to our second contention is that it's not our current policy, you can cleanly extend when I tell you it is current policy when we're expanding the aid we're giving. So first, 3 million people displaced and 300 civilians killed. These are the easiest places to vote on the affirmative case. They have no offense coming off of theirs. Thank you.
Let's see if 90%. First, to start with a friend. Remember, first you're going to prefer the long term to prove that's actually more benefit than the short term cost harm. But second, if really have to look towards current policy, which is really going to hurt because most of their impacts are outdated. And last, remember, they also did that violence outweighs all of their impacts to those grounds, so that's really the focus. With that, let's look to the supposed harms, and really all of it comes down to violence and the thinking strategy. The two problems with it is remember, it's all based on the thinking strategy, which is outdated as of 2 weeks ago. They never responded. It's not our current policy, you throw that out. But even more so, at the point where all the increase in Central America is due to militarization in Mexico, another thing they never respond to, we're actually decreasing militarization in Mexico by 87%. All of the links to increasing violence in Central America are essentially not unique, they're not happening anymore. We're discontinuing that. That's not our current policy. Do not let them get any of those impacts. The next is going to benefits. And first we talk about money laundering. You can drop all of their terrorist responses because they ignore the major evidence, which is the internal link and exists specifically through money laundering efforts in the status quo. We're able to decrease cartels in the long term. The link to terrorism is cartels. As though we're decreasing cartels in the long term, so they never respond to through our efforts today. That's another benefit in the long term. There will be no cartels which are responsible for massive increase in violence. The next is going to the main benefit in today's round, which is judicial reform. And they have several responses. First, the increase in militarization. First, we show you empirically it's not true. Mexico and Colombia were decreasing by 87%. Next, they talk about an increase in Central America. First, their evidence about increasing 3.5% is a budget request that actually never happened. But even more so, the pleasure, all the increase in violence is due to militarization in Mexico, and we're decreasing that. That's the internal link to increase in Central America. They never respond to it. That's not happening. That's not our current policy. But next, they talk about how Nieto won't do this. When Nieto was governor of Mexico City, it's the first thing he did as governor, and it's already happening. We've done it in 5 Mexican states in the status quo. It is happening. But next, they talk about how Nieto's creating a military army, which is militarization. His army, like my partner Barbara Buttle, is not used for militarization. In fact, it uses, according to Diana Priest from the Washington Post, it uses police reforms to actually keep violence at a minimum. It's not military, it's a massive police force to decrease violence. That's another benefit. The next, they talk about how 90% of these convictions are wrong. That evidence is from 2010. We did not start reforming in 2012. All that's outdated. That's not judicial reform. It's currently working. They say violence is increasing. And since the 1980s, when we didn't have a policy, those are actual impacts. We're seeing violence in Mexico is going down by 28%. Violence in Colombia has gone down to 57%. And City Juarez has gone down to 47%. These are all empirically true.
So, 3 months after Nieto's election, he says, quote, Mexican armed forces would remain on the streets indefinitely.
Okay.
What does that mean?
It means last week he said he will not continue the practice of targeting
Okay.
cartel leaders.
But,
Yes.
so,
Wait,
so
did you
his
say
word
where he
is obviously
definitively
very
says he
unreliable,
will?
right?
I
Because
heard
he's
the
telling
court
us
say-
both 2 different things.
I mean, I just read you that.
Well, not us, but like
He
the
says
people
he
saying.
is
Okay.
thinking about backing away from it.
What he's saying is he doesn't know how long.
I want to
it
hear
will
what he
take-
says,
Grant,
not what
yes.
you say.
The card you just read says that the military will stay indefinitely. That doesn't mean he's not drawing
Can
back
I read the
on
card
it.
about kingpinning where it says
Okay,
he will
right.
no longer
So-
practice it at all?
Really quickly, right? The problem here is that your second observation is
Hold
that
on, wait,
we
I
evaluate.
shoot. Can I ask you a question?
This is really important. So your second observation holds us to the standard of evaluating the round based on current current policies, right? Nieto's proposed future policies are not current policies.
Okay, so, let's look, I wanna look at what you just read me. You said that he wants to keep the military indefinitely. Does that mean he's increasing the military, or does it mean there's a?
3.5% by funding.
Okay, that's not Nieto, and that's a budget proposal, which you yourself said hasn't come into fruition. If we look at what's
I
actually
feel like
happened.
that would be more reliable than Nieto's proposed.
Okay, so if you wanna look at what Nieto's, sure, let's look at what Nieto's doing, which you actually brought up. He's creating this police force to minimize violence. That's
Yeah,
what he's
except
actually doing.
He's
instituting
creating a
judicial
military force that he's renaming as the gendarmerie. Renaming something does not change the intent
No.
or
He's not
impact.
renaming
It's a-
something.
He
It's
says
a
he's
force-
still
That's
going
just
to
a
use it to
fundamental
crack down on
misunderstanding.
The
violence.
gendarmerie is the paramilitary
No, it's
force
not.
Hold on,
named.
let me explain. What he said is we're creating a force of military discipline, but using
This is
police
rhetorical.
Wait,
tactics.
let him finish.
The
They're using
centerpiece.
police tactics to keep violence at a minimum. That's specifically what
This is why we
Nieto
read
said.
this to you. The centerpiece of Nieto's plans is the creation of a 10,000-person national gendarmerie
Yes.
or paramilitary force.
And it's
We
great
have
that
the
you
same
use that
thing.
term, but if you
Paramilitary?
look, if you look at what they're actually being trained to do, they're being trained to reduce
To
violence.
go and how by attacking
Are they being
the Mexican
trained as a
judge.
No,
military or
they're
police?
ending kingpin strategy.
They are ending.
Which is why we saw a 50% increase in violence.
Okay, that's since the 80s.
50%.
And since
But
2001,
since, like,
Since
One,
2013.
we've seen 11%
from then
increase.
to now.
Since
And you've never made this
2013.
argument. Why would you not make this argument
And
until the final?
also the
You just
response
said
to the decrease in violence in the cherry-picked cities that you chose can be explained by a violence
Okay,
bullying effect,
so
which
those-
is
am I
most
correct?
important analysis.
Wait, am I correct that the cherry picked cities were the ones where we instituted judicial reform?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Argument.
Yeah.
Okay, but we also tell you that your judicial reform is corrupt because 90% false.
Okay, so
false-
why did
From
violence fall
2000.
50%?
I don't know. Are there less
Issue.
people to kill?
That whole 90% It's like from 2010.
Or maybe criminals just
People-
move
Wait,
to a
let's
different
take
part
this,
of the
guys,
country.
Maybe
Let's
there's
take a
nowhere to
finish,
go
please.
but down
No,
because we're
all
killing
of the
that.
responses are not talking about our current policy. Our current policy since 2012, your evidence from 2010, 2 years before we even started this. So the conviction rate was in the past. You're seeing corruption decrease. That's why it's
The
working.
3.5 empirical increasing is from 2013.
There are three problems with President Nietzsche's rhetoric. First, that it's his rhetoric and not what other people are saying. Second, it's going to be the fact that it's not actually what's being implemented, it's what's going to happen in the future, not what's happening in the status quo. And third, and most importantly, it's not what's actually happening. You can infer the analysis that we give you from military analysts in the country who say because they still want United States aid, and because it is still United States practice policy of kingpinning, that this will still occur. She just says that Nieto is going to move away or will not do this policy, but our evidence is better because it's not coming from the president, and it's more specific in telling you that he's still going to practice the policy, and he's still going to be increasing drug cartel violence. Militarization occurs in the status quo. You can extend the 3.5% analysis. Just because it looked like it was going to go down doesn't mean that it's not going up. Then you can also extend the Newman analysis, which really doesn't get responded to, which specifically tells you there's going to be an exponential increase throughout the region. This isn't getting touched. It's telling you that militarization is occurring at a faster rate throughout the region. We're going to still be generating impacts, and renaming a paramilitary, renaming something doesn't actually change the impact or the intent of it. It's still used to fight drug cartel problems. Then on the judicial system impacts, they don't answer the responses here or the turn. So at that point, that's at least going to mitigate their offense because they're just falsely prosecuting control, pushing the violence to other parts of the region. And third, and most importantly, we tell you that once they come out, they're going to be more likely to join the cartels. That's going to increase cartel violence. They don't respond to any of this. Then, at that point, you're going to be giving us access to the fact that there's more militarization throughout the region, which gains us access to that 50% number that doesn't get touched until the Grand Crossfire. That's a 50% increase in homicide rates throughout Latin America. We've been drawing the direct link because you're going to be increasing militarization. Militarization causes violence because you're arming people to go fight each other, and that always causes collateral damage. That's the analysis we draw. Their analysis about how there's going to be this new jam marine and how Nieto's going to move away, it's all talking about what he might do in the future. But in the status quo, I should read you evidence that they are going to be remaining there indefinitely and that they're always going to be a problem now. This 67% number that they're talking about, a shift in how Merida is funded, doesn't look to overall funding rates. You can't prefer that analysis. That's not telling you what's going on, and it's not telling you what's going on in Colombia. Prefer the impacts that are throughout Colombia, and you can also extend that 9,000 line that we're giving you off the first contention about increased cocaine death due to prison. Thank you.
Riley,
Everyone's ready? Right, okay, ready? Remember they agreed that the most important impact in today's round is going to be violence and looking at lives. Remember they don't show you actual harms of our current policy and our current shift in policy. The only evidence they give you about violence going down since the 1980s doesn't take into account the most recent year where we actually see violence in Mexico specifically decreasing by 28%. Remember the card that they never respond to? First of all, Mazar, that tells you we're able to take out cartels through other non-violent means, specifically by taking out all of their financial operations. That's in our first contention, specifically tells you that's the most effective way to deal with them. They completely drop this in today's round. Furthermore, you can look to the national interest card I read you in my rebuttal, also goes completely dropped, telling you specifically that increased cartel activity and violence in Central America is specifically because of militarization in Mexico alone. That's what we're telling you. If we can improve demilitarization in Mexico, we're reducing that violence and we're reducing that effect, and we're not gaining that, and they're not gaining any offense off of that in today's round. Remember that we're not doing Kingpin anymore. They tell you he's afraid of the United States, give you absolutely no logical reason for why he would be afraid of the United States when the United States is empirically demilitarizing and moving away from that type of policy. Nieto has come out and said he's not doing it anymore. They're not doing it anymore. Remember, we're looking to the fact that they say that there's a 3.5 potential increase from a budget proposal in military and police assistance, but then goes on to say, but there is an overall downward trend. And that's the exact type of thing that we're looking for in today's round, is a downward trend. So Grant tells you, look at what's actually happening in today's round. Look at what's actually been approved by the United States government. John Kerry says the continuity of these policies is what's important. 87% decrease in military aid, 92% increase in institution building. What has actually happened. We've seen violence go down by almost 50% in the most violent cities in the world, and we've seen less corruption, judges actually showing up. In Colombia, we saw violence go down, specifically with the same type of plan. It worked there in 6 years, and it's working in Mexico, and that's why you empirically see over the past year, violence going down in Mexico by 28%. They give you numbers about the 1980s. I don't care. We're looking at what our current policy is, and that's the only number about current policy in today's round, with the violence actually going down. That's the 28% we give you. We show you the spending going down. We show you Nieto's current policies have changed from the past. We show you demilitarization. So for those reasons, I strongly urge a con ballot. Thank you. Oh, good stuff. You want our budget card?
Hey. No, it's fine.
No, I'm going.
No, really, it's fine.
Okay.
That was a super good round.